The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Buckingham Palace as Queen Elizabeth II sat in her private study, holding a letter that would change everything. The elegant handwriting belonged to her grandson's friend, a young soldier who had lost both legs in Afghanistan. He had written to thank her for a visit she had made to the military hospital, but it was what he said next that made her hands tremble slightly. "Your Majesty, when you held my hand and cried with my mother, you broke every rule in the book. But you gave us something more precious than protocol, you gave us hope." The Queen set the letter down carefully on her mahogany desk. For 70 years, she had followed every rule, every tradition, every protocol that came with the crown. She had been taught from childhood that emotions were private, that tears were weakness, that the monarch must remain above human feeling. Yet increasingly, she found herself questioning these ancient rules. Margaret, her lady-in-waiting, knocked softly and entered. "Ma'am, the Prime Minister is here for your weekly audience." Elizabeth nodded, but her mind wandered to yesterday's events. She had been scheduled for a formal visit to a children's hospital, a standard royal engagement with carefully planned routes, selected patients, and scripted conversations. But when she saw little Sarah, a 7-year-old girl with leukemia, something inside her shifted. The child had been too shy to speak, hiding behind her mother's skirt. Protocol demanded that the Queen maintain her distance, shake hands formally, and move to the next patient. Instead, Elizabeth had knelt down on the hospital floor, her expensive dress touching the cold linoleum, and whispered, "I have a secret garden at my house. Would you like to hear about the rabbits?" Sarah's eyes had lit up, and soon she was giggling as the Queen described how the palace corgis chased butterflies but were too lazy to catch them. The scheduled 15-minute visit stretched to an hour. Security shifted nervously. The schedule was ruined. But Sarah smiled for the first time in months. "Your Majesty?" Margaret's voice brought her back to the present. "Yes, of course." "Send him in." The Prime Minister entered with his usual formal bow. David Cameron was a man who understood rules and hierarchy, much like herself. But, as he began discussing economic policies and international relations, Elizabeth found her thoughts drifting again. She remembered another recent incident that had caused whispers among the palace staff. During a state dinner with the President of France, she had noticed that one of the young waiters, a college student working part-time, was visibly shaking as he served the soup course. His hands trembled so much that the ladle clinked against the bowl. Protocol demanded that such incidents be ignored, that the smooth facade of royal perfection continue uninterrupted. But Elizabeth had caught the young man's eye and given him the slightest wink, followed by an encouraging nod. The relief that washed over his face was immediate. His hand steadied, and he completed his duties with newfound confidence. Her private secretary later informed her that several guests had noticed the interaction. Some called it undignified. Others found it charming. Elizabeth didn't care about either opinion, she cared about a frightened young man who needed a moment of human connection. "Ma'am, if I may ask your thoughts on the proposed trade agreement?" Elizabeth refocused on the Prime Minister, offering the appropriate responses while part of her mind continued to wander. These small rebellions against protocol had been increasing over recent months. There was the time she had personally called the mother of a fallen soldier instead of sending the traditional formal letter. The time she had stopped her motorcade to comfort a crying child who had dropped his ice cream. The time she had invited a homeless veteran into the palace for a proper meal after meeting him during a charity event. Each incident had caused ripples of concern among her staff. "Not proper," they whispered. "Setting dangerous precedents. What will people think?" But Elizabeth was beginning to realize that she cared less about what people thought and more about what people felt. At 91 years old, she was discovering that perhaps the greatest service she could offer her people wasn't perfect adherence to dusty protocols, but genuine human connection. The meeting with the Prime Minister concluded, and she found herself alone again with her thoughts and the soldier's letter. She picked up her fountain pen and began to write a response, not through official channels, not dictated to a secretary, but in her own hand with her own words. "Dear James," she began, using his first name instead of the formal address protocols demanded. "Your letter moved me deeply, and I want you to know that holding your hand was not a break in protocol, it was exactly what protocol should be." As she wrote, Elizabeth thought about her father, King George VI, and the advice he had given her as a young princess. "Remember, Lilibet," he had said, using her childhood nickname, "the crown is not just a symbol of power, it's a symbol of service. And true service sometimes means breaking the rules to reach the heart. At the time, she had been too young to fully understand his meaning. Now, decades later, his words resonated with new clarity. Perhaps all these years of perfect protocol adherence had created a barrier between herself and the very people she had sworn to serve. She finished the letter and sealed it personally, instructing that it be delivered directly without going through official channels. Another small rebellion, but one that felt increasingly necessary. Later that evening, as she walked through the palace gardens with her corgis, Elizabeth reflected on the changes she was experiencing. The weight of the crown felt different now, not lighter, but somehow more purposeful. Each breach of protocol wasn't a failure of duty, but a fulfillment of a deeper calling. She thought of her great-great-grandmother, Queen Victoria, who had also faced criticism for some of her more human moments. Victoria had mourned publicly for her beloved Albert, breaking royal tradition. She had shown genuine emotion and vulnerability, and history had not judged her harshly for it. Perhaps it was time for a different kind of monarchy, one that honored tradition while embracing humanity. As Elizabeth stood in the garden where she had once played as a child, she made a quiet decision. She would continue to serve her people faithfully, but she would do so with her heart as much as her head. The rules that had once seemed so important, maintaining distance, avoiding emotional displays, following rigid protocols, suddenly felt less like protection and more like prison walls. She was ready to tear them down, one small act of human kindness at a time. Back in her study, she noticed another letter on her desk, this one from Sarah's mother at the children's hospital. Your Majesty, I don't know if this is proper protocol, but I wanted to tell you that Sarah has been talking about rabbits and butterflies every day since your visit. She's been eating better and sleeping peacefully. Thank you for seeing her not as a patient, but as a child who needed magic in her life. Elizabeth smiled, feeling more certain than ever that her instincts were right. The monarchy would survive these small rebellions, in fact, it might emerge stronger because of them. Tomorrow, she would find new ways to serve with her heart wide open, protocol be damned. As she prepared for bed, Elizabeth looked at herself in the mirror and saw not just a queen, but a woman who had finally learned that true strength sometimes came from showing vulnerability, and that the greatest royal duty was simply being human. 3 weeks after her decision to embrace a more human approach to monarchy, Queen Elizabeth II found herself facing her first real test. The autumn morning brought devastating news. A terrorist attack in Manchester had claimed dozens of lives, including several children. Within hours, the palace machinery was in motion, preparing the standard response, formal statements, flowers at the scene, and a carefully managed visit with predetermined routes and security protocols. But Elizabeth had different plans. "Ma'am, we simply cannot deviate from security protocols," Sir Edward Hartwell, her private secretary, insisted as they reviewed the proposed visit schedule. The area is still considered high risk, and, frankly, after recent informalities, there are concerns about maintaining proper decorum during such a sensitive time. Elizabeth studied the faces in the photographs: a 5-year-old girl named Emma who had been separated from her mother in the chaos, an elderly man who had shielded strangers with his own body, teenagers who had helped carry the wounded to safety. These were not statistics to be managed through protocol. These were her people, and they were hurting. "Sir Edward," she said quietly, "I understand your concerns. But I will not hide behind bulletproof glass while families are burying their children." The palace staff exchanged worried glances. Since her recent shift in approach, they had noticed changes in the Queen's demeanor. She asked more questions about the people she was scheduled to meet. She requested detailed background information not for security purposes, but to understand their personal stories. She had even begun writing personal notes to staff members on their birthdays, a practice that had both touched and confused the household. Against all advice, Elizabeth insisted on visiting the Manchester Memorial site without the usual barriers. She wanted to walk among the flowers, to touch the teddy bears left by children, to read the messages written by ordinary people expressing their grief and solidarity. The night before her visit, she called her grandson William privately. Their conversation lasted over an hour, another breach of protocol, as royal phone calls were typically brief and formal. "Grandmother, are you certain about this?" William asked. "The security risks aside, the media will scrutinize every gesture, every word." "William, when your grandfather was killed in that car accident when you were young, do you remember what mattered most to you?" There was silence on the line before William answered softly, "That someone understood our pain. That we weren't alone." "Exactly. Protocol protected us from showing that understanding for too long. The next morning in Manchester, Elizabeth's decision to break with tradition immediately became apparent. Instead of the usual formal walkabout with predetermined stops, she moved through the crowd of mourners naturally, stopping wherever she felt called to connect. When she encountered Maria Santos, a young mother clutching a photograph of her 6-year-old son who had been killed in the attack, Protocol demanded a formal expression of sympathy and a quick movement to the next person. Instead, Elizabeth took both of Maria's hands and looked directly into her eyes. "Tell me about your son," she said simply. For 30 minutes, Maria spoke about Antonio's love of football, his habit of singing in the shower, his dream of becoming a firefighter. Elizabeth listened to every word, asked questions about his favorite songs, nodded when Maria laughed through her tears describing his terrible attempts at cooking breakfast for Mother's Day. The scheduled timeline was completely abandoned. Security personnel fidgeted nervously. Television cameras captured every moment, broadcasting the Queen's tears as Maria collapsed in grief, and Elizabeth instinctively pulled her into an embrace. Later, when critics would question the appropriateness of such displays of emotion, Elizabeth would remember the weight of Maria's grief in her arms and know she had made the right choice. She moved through the crowd, collecting stories rather than maintaining schedule. There was Thomas, a teenager who had carried 3 wounded strangers to safety and couldn't stop apologizing for not saving more. Elizabeth knelt on the sidewalk where he sat, her security detail creating a protective circle around them, and told him about a young soldier she had known who carried similar guilt. "The heart that mourns those we couldn't save is the same heart that drives us to save others," she told him. "Your pain is proof of your goodness, not your failure." When she encountered a group of Muslim community leaders who had organized relief efforts but felt conflicted about approaching the memorial due to public hostility, Elizabeth made another spontaneous decision. She walked directly to them, extended her hand to the eldest imam, and spoke clearly enough for nearby cameras to capture her words. "Your faith calls you to comfort the suffering, just as mine does. There is no difference in our grief today." The image of the Queen shaking hands with the imam while surrounded by flowers and teddy bears would later appear on front pages around the world. Some praised her inclusive message. Others criticized her for making political statements. Elizabeth paid attention to neither group. She was focused on the relief she saw in the faces of the Muslim families who had been living in fear since the attack. By the time she returned to London that evening, social media was buzzing with unprecedented footage. Video showed the Queen sitting on curbs with grieving strangers, wiping tears from children's faces, and ignoring her security detail to chase after a traumatized dog that had belonged to one of the victims. The palace switchboard was overwhelmed with calls. Most were positive, people expressing gratitude for a monarch who seemed genuinely connected to their pain. But there were complaints too. Conservative voices worried about the dignity of the monarchy. International allies questioned whether Britain's head of state was becoming too emotionally involved in day-to-day events. That evening, Elizabeth sat in her private quarters reading through the initial press reports. Margaret brought her dinner on a tray, something that only happened when the Queen was deeply troubled or completely exhausted. "Ma'am, perhaps you should rest. Today was intense." Elizabeth looked up from the newspapers. "Margaret, in all your years of service, have you ever seen me more tired after a day of protocol meetings or more energized after a day like today?" Margaret considered the question carefully. The Queen did look tired, but there was something different in her eyes, a brightness that had been absent during the carefully choreographed events of previous years. "You do seem more present, ma'am. More yourself." "Precisely. Today I wasn't playing the role of queen, I was being the queen I was meant to be." Later that night, Elizabeth received an unexpected phone call. It was Maria Santos, calling from Manchester. Palace protocol strictly prohibited such direct contact, but somehow the grieving mother had convinced an operator to put her through. "Your Majesty, I hope it's okay that I called. I just wanted to thank you for today. For the first time since Antonio died, I feel like someone truly saw him. Not as a victim or a tragedy, but as the beautiful little boy he was." Elizabeth closed her eyes, feeling the weight of Maria's gratitude. "Mrs. Santos, thank you for sharing him with me. I will carry Antonio's story with me always." After the call ended, Elizabeth sat in the darkness of her study, contemplating the events of the day. Every breach of protocol had felt natural, necessary, right. She had touched lives in ways that formal procedures never could have accomplished. She thought about the criticism that would inevitably come, the questions about whether she was setting dangerous precedents, the concerns about security and dignity and tradition. None of it mattered as much as the memory of Thomas's shoulders relaxing when he realized someone understood his guilt, or Maria's smile when she described Antonio's terrible cooking attempts. The Queen picked up her private phone and dialed another number that protocol would have forbidden, the direct line to the Archbishop of Canterbury. It was past midnight, but she needed to speak with someone who might understand the spiritual dimensions of her evolving approach to monarchy. "Your Grace, I hope I haven't woken you. I need to discuss something important about duty and service." As she spoke with the Archbishop about the difference between serving an institution and serving people, Elizabeth felt the last of her doubts dissolving. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to choose between protocol and humanity. But tonight, she was certain she was finally becoming the queen her people needed her to be. The backlash came swiftly and from unexpected quarters. 2 months after Manchester, Queen Elizabeth II found herself sitting across from the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Prime Minister in an emergency meeting that would never appear on any official schedule. The morning newspapers spread across the conference table told a story of divided opinion about her increasingly personal approach to royal duties. "Ma'am," the Prime Minister began carefully, "we need to address the growing concerns about consistency in royal protocol. Yesterday's incident at the Veterans' Home has created quite a stir." Elizabeth knew exactly what incident he meant. During what should have been a routine visit to Sunrise Manor, a care facility for elderly veterans, she had encountered George Pemberton, a 95-year-old former RAF pilot who was dying alone. His family lived in Australia and couldn't afford to visit. When she learned that George had flown missions over the same areas where her own father had served, something inside her broke. Protocol demanded a brief handshake, pleasant conversation, and movement to the next resident. Instead, Elizabeth had spent 3 hours at George's bedside, holding his hand while he shared stories about flying Spitfires and missing his late wife. When he asked if she would stay with him because he was frightened, she dismissed her security detail and remained until he fell into peaceful sleep. The photograph that appeared in the Daily Mail showed the Queen of England sitting beside a hospital bed, her crown nowhere in sight, looking like any grandmother comforting a dying man. The caption read, "Is this still our monarchy?" "The institution of the crown relies on certain boundaries," the Archbishop added gently. "While your compassion is admirable, there are concerns that the mystique necessary for effective monarchy is being eroded." Elizabeth studied both men, noting their sincere worry. These weren't critics seeking to diminish her role, they were advisors who genuinely believed she was undermining the very foundations that had kept the monarchy relevant for over 1,000 years. "Gentlemen, may I ask you a question?" Elizabeth said quietly. "When did we decide that mystique was more important than humanity?" The Prime Minister shifted uncomfortably. "Ma'am, it's not about choosing one over the other. It's about balance. The public needs to see the crown as something aspirational, elevated above everyday concerns. But what if the public needs something different now? What if they need to see that their queen understands their everyday concerns because she shares them?" Elizabeth rose and walked to the window overlooking the palace gardens. She could see tourists gathered at the gates, holding flowers and handmade cards. Since Manchester, these spontaneous displays of affection had become daily occurrences. People weren't coming to gawk at royalty anymore, they were coming to connect with someone they perceived as genuinely caring. 3 days ago, I received a letter from a young mother in Wales, Elizabeth continued. Her daughter has autism and was being bullied at school. She wrote to me not because I'm queen, but because she had seen me spending time with disabled children at the hospital, treating them with the same attention I give to heads of state. She said, "Your Majesty cares about children like mine. That's not erosion of mystique, that's expansion of purpose." The Archbishop leaned forward. "But, ma'am, consider the precedent. If every monarch begins involving themselves emotionally with individual subjects, where does it end? How do you maintain the objectivity necessary for constitutional duties?" Elizabeth turned back to face them. "Let me tell you about objectivity, Your Grace. Last week, during my constitutional meeting with the Justice Secretary about prison reform, I found myself thinking about Michael." Both men looked puzzled. "Michael is a former gang member I met during an unscheduled stop at a youth center in Liverpool. He told me about growing up with an addicted mother, sleeping in cars, stealing food to survive. When I listened to the Justice Secretary's statistical analysis of recidivism rates, all I could think about was Michael's face when he described the teacher who changed his life by simply believing in him. Elizabeth sat back down, her decision crystallizing. I made better constitutional decisions because I had looked into the eyes of someone affected by those policies. Humanity informed my duty rather than hindering it. The Prime Minister consulted his notes. Ma'am, I understand the personal connection, but there are practical concerns. Security expenses have increased 40% due to your unscheduled stops. The Royal Protection Unit is struggling to adapt to your spontaneous approach. And, frankly, some of your interactions have created diplomatic complications. He was referring to her recent visit to a mosque in Birmingham, where she had removed her shoes and sat on the floor with elderly Muslim women, sharing tea and listening to their experiences of discrimination. The image had caused controversy in some circles, while inspiring profound gratitude in others. The Turkish ambassador questioned whether such specific religious engagement was appropriate for the head of the Church of England. The Prime Minister continued. Elizabeth smiled sadly. The Turkish ambassador missed the point entirely. I wasn't engaging with their religion, I was engaging with their humanity. The women I met that day weren't Muslim subjects or Christian subjects, they were simply my subjects, deserving of respect and attention. The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock. Margaret entered with a message that the Queen had specifically requested to receive immediately. Ma'am, this just arrived from Manchester General Hospital. Elizabeth read the note quickly, and her face lit up with the first genuine smile she had shown during the entire meeting. Gentlemen, Maria Santos, the mother I met at the Manchester Memorial, has just given birth to a healthy baby girl. She named her Elizabeth. The silence in the room was profound. This child will grow up knowing that the Queen of England held her grieving mother when she thought her world had ended. She'll know that sometimes rules matter less than love. Tell me, how is that a weakness of the Crown? The Archbishop cleared his throat. Ma'am, no one questions your compassion or its impact on individuals. But, we must consider the broader implications for the institution. Elizabeth stood again, this time with unmistakable authority. Your Grace, Prime Minister, I want to share something with you that I hope will clarify my position. This morning, before you arrived, I received a call from the Governor-General of Canada. Youth suicide rates in Indigenous communities have been devastating, and traditional government outreach has failed completely. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. However, 3 young people who were planning to take their own lives changed their minds after seeing the Manchester footage. They said watching me sit on a sidewalk with a grieving teenager made them realize that if the Queen of England could show pain and still choose to care for others, maybe they could find ways to keep living too. The impact of this revelation was immediate. Both men stared at her with new understanding. I don't know about you, gentlemen, but I consider 3 lives saved worth any amount of disrupted protocol. Elizabeth walked to her desk and picked up a thick folder. This contains over 2,000 letters I've received since beginning this approach. Letters from cancer patients who say my hospital visits gave them courage to continue treatment. Letters from veterans who say my willingness to cry with them helped them seek therapy for trauma. Letters from minority families who say my mosque and synagogue visits made them feel truly British for the first time. She set the folder in front of them. Now, gentlemen, I ask you, what exactly is the institution of monarchy supposed to accomplish if not this? The Prime Minister and Archbishop exchanged glances, both recognizing that they were not dealing with an impulsive decision but with a fundamental evolution in royal philosophy. Elizabeth continued, her voice gentle but unwavering. I understand your concerns, and I don't dismiss them lightly. But I believe we're witnessing something remarkable, the transformation of monarchy from symbol to servant. Not the abandonment of duty, but its fulfillment. She walked to the door, signaling the meeting's end. The crown will survive my tears, gentlemen. But I'm no longer certain it would survive my silence. As the 2 men left, Elizabeth returned to her desk and began writing responses to the day's correspondence, each one personal, each one pushing against the boundaries of what a queen was supposed to say and feel. Outside her window, the crowd of well-wishers continued to grow, drawn not by royal mystique, but by the radical notion that their monarch was, fundamentally, one of them. 6 months after her conversation with the Prime Minister and Archbishop, Queen Elizabeth II stood on the balcony of Buckingham Palace watching the largest crowd in recent memory gather below. They weren't there for a celebration or ceremony, they had come spontaneously after news broke of her latest protocol violation, and this one was her most controversial yet. The story began 3 weeks earlier when Elizabeth learned about Rebecca Morrison, a single mother in Glasgow whose 8-year-old son Jamie had been killed by a drunk driver. Rebecca had written to the Queen not seeking attention, but simply expressing gratitude for how Elizabeth's changed approach to monarchy had inspired her to keep fighting for victims' rights legislation. Against every piece of advice from her staff, Elizabeth had traveled to Glasgow privately, without media announcement or official engagement. She had gone to Rebecca's modest apartment and spent an entire day helping her plan Jamie's funeral, not as Queen of England, but as one mother comforting another. The media discovered the visit only when neighbors began sharing photographs of the Queen carrying flowers into the housing estate, helping to arrange memorial photos, and sitting on Rebecca's sofa while they wrote Jamie's eulogy together. The sight of the monarch in an ordinary living room, her crown replaced by a simple headscarf as she helped fold Jamie's favorite clothes, had created an unprecedented global response. "Ma'am," Margaret said softly, joining her on the balcony, "the crowds have been growing all day. There are people from 27 countries down there." Elizabeth nodded, watching as families held up signs reading "Thank you for showing us how to grieve" and "Our Queen understands us." But she also knew that below the balcony, intense debates were raging about whether she had gone too far. The criticism had been severe. Constitutional scholars argued that she had blurred the lines between personal charity and official duty beyond repair. Some politicians worried that her emotional involvement in individual cases was setting precedents that could compromise the political neutrality essential to constitutional monarchy. Even some supporters expressed concern that she was wearing herself out emotionally by absorbing so much personal pain. But the letters kept coming. Thousands of them. Parents of disabled children writing to say her hospital visits had changed how their communities treated their families. Elderly people in care homes reporting that staff treated them better after seeing how she interacted with residents. Immigrants describing how her mosque and community center visits had reduced local hostility toward newcomers. Elizabeth's private phone rang, a direct call that her staff would normally screen, but she had instructed that certain numbers be put through immediately. "Your Majesty, this is Rebecca Morrison. I hope I'm not disturbing you." Elizabeth smiled. "Rebecca, never. How are you managing today?" "Ma'am, I called because I've been watching the news about all the criticism you're facing. I wanted you to know that what you did for Jamie and me, it wasn't about protocol or politics. It was about love. And love is never wrong." As they spoke, Elizabeth watched the crowd below growing larger. Signs appeared in multiple languages. She could see families with disabled children, elderly veterans, young Muslims, Christian clergy, Jewish rabbis, a cross-section of British society united by something that transcended traditional royal protocol. After ending the call with Rebecca, Elizabeth made a decision that would surprise even those who had grown accustomed to her evolving approach. She instructed her staff to open the palace gates and invite representatives from the crowd to join her for an unprecedented public conversation. Within hours, the palace's largest reception room hosted an extraordinary gathering. Maria Santos had flown in from Manchester with baby Elizabeth. Thomas, the teenager who had rescued attack victims, sat next to George Pemberton from the veterans' home. Michael, the former gang member from Liverpool, was there alongside the Muslim women from Birmingham and families Elizabeth had met during hospital visits. No media was permitted, no official record kept. This was simply a queen talking with her people about what monarchy meant in the 21st century. "I invited you here," Elizabeth began, "because each of you has been part of my journey toward understanding what true service looks like. But I need to be honest with you about the concerns being raised about my approach." She outlined the criticisms clearly, the constitutional questions, the security concerns, the worry that emotional involvement compromised royal objectivity. She spoke about the pressure to return to traditional protocols and the fear that her actions were weakening the institution of monarchy. Then, she did something no British monarch had ever done. She asked for their advice. Maria stood first. "Your Majesty, when you held me at Antonio's memorial, you weren't being less than a queen, you were being more than one. You were being human. And that's what we needed." Thomas nodded vigorously. "The old way made you seem like a statue. Beautiful, but cold. Now you're real. And that makes everything you represent feel more real too." George, despite his age and weakness, struggled to his feet. "Ma'am, I've lived through 8 monarchs. Never seen one who understood that the crown's power comes from the people's love, not from keeping distance from them." One by one, they shared their perspectives. The conversation lasted 4 hours, covering everything from the role of tradition in modern society to the difference between dignity and remoteness. Elizabeth listened more than she spoke, taking notes in a simple notebook. Near the end, Michael made an observation that would stay with her forever. "Your Majesty, you know what's funny? The more human you act, the more royal you seem. Like royalty isn't about being above us, it's about being the best of us." That evening, Elizabeth sat in her study writing the most important speech of her reign. She had decided to address the nation directly about her evolving approach to monarchy, knowing that this would either solidify her new direction or force her to retreat to traditional protocols. The next day, she appeared on national television not from the throne room or a formal setting, but from the same study where she had first decided to prioritize humanity over protocol. She wore a simple dress, no crown, no elaborate backdrop. "My dear people," she began, "for 70 years, I have served as your queen according to traditions established over centuries. These traditions have provided stability, continuity, and dignity to our constitutional system. I honor them and always will." She paused, looking directly into the camera. "But I have learned something in recent months that I believe my predecessors would have understood, even if they couldn't always act upon it. The crown exists to serve the people, not the other way around. And service, real service, requires connection." Elizabeth spoke about the letters she had received, the lives that had been touched, the communities that had been brought together by her willingness to step outside traditional boundaries. She acknowledged the legitimate concerns about protocol and precedent. "But, I ask you to consider this, what is the purpose of majesty if it cannot comfort the grieving? What is the value of dignity if it prevents us from showing love? What is the meaning of tradition if it stops us from growing?" She concluded with words that would be quoted for generations: "I remain your queen, bound by the same oath I swore 70 years ago. But, I have learned that serving faithfully doesn't mean serving from a distance. It means serving from the heart." The response was unprecedented. Polling showed approval ratings higher than any monarch in British history. More importantly, the letters continued to pour in, from around the Commonwealth and beyond, describing communities inspired by the example of leadership that combined authority with empathy. 3 months later, Elizabeth stood again on the palace balcony watching another crowd. This time, they had gathered to celebrate something remarkable. Britain had become the first nation in the developed world to see significant decreases in youth suicide, elder neglect, and community violence in the same year. Researchers attributed much of the change to what they called the Elizabeth effect, a cultural shift toward greater empathy and community connection inspired by their monarch's example. As she waved to the crowd, Elizabeth thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. Each broken protocol had been a risk, each emotional moment a potential crisis. But, together, they had created something unprecedented, a monarchy that was both strong and tender, both traditional and revolutionary. Margaret joined her on the balcony, carrying the day's correspondence. "Ma'am, there's a letter here from a young girl in Canada. She says she wants to be queen someday, but only if she can be the kind of queen who helps people feel less alone." Elizabeth smiled, knowing that the future of the monarchy was secure in ways that no amount of protocol could guarantee. She had learned that sometimes, the greatest service to tradition was knowing when to transcend it. And, sometimes, the most royal thing a queen could do was simply be human. The crowd below began singing "God Save the Queen," but the words carried new meaning now. They weren't singing to a distant figure on a throne, they were singing to someone who had shown them that true majesty lay not in perfection, but in the courage to love openly and serve completely. As the sun set over London, Elizabeth knew that her reign would be remembered not for the protocols she had followed, but for the protocols she had broken in service of something higher. She had discovered that the greatest crown a monarch could wear was the trust and love of their people, and that crown was earned not through distance, but through connection.